powered by marine renewable energy. We're very lucky to have Marcel Kroese here, who is going to present to us. I was lucky enough to meet Marcel in Cambodia a few weeks ago, who is working with FAO, and he's very friendly with our team doing the fisheries project in Cambodia. So Marcel, I'll hand over to you. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to just do this quick introduction to alternative proteins for you, and especially powered by marine renewable energy. I'll do some explaining of what the energy needs are and some of the supply chain considerations. Why even consider alternative proteins and renewable energy from the marine environment? Well, firstly, in the region, fish and seafood products represent the main source of animal protein for most of the population. According to FAO, it's about 36 kilograms per annual per person. That's about double the world average, and it constitutes about 42% of total animal intake, so important. Just explaining a little bit further the regional importance of fish on a bit more visual scale. You can definitely see that China is a big sink for seafood. And if you look here at the percentage of fish in the total protein, you can see it's extremely high. Asia and Southeast Asia, probably some of the highest portions in the world compared to the rest. So some facts and figures. I'm just going to run through this extremely briefly. It's mainly there for reference. Global system causes 34% of the global food system causes 34% of global greenhouse emissions. Most of it is about half of that is for today's protein production. If you're wondering where all of these things come from, there's a reference list right at the end, and you can find all the references in there. Not only is the food system causing the greenhouse emissions, but there's also food waste and food loss, which is about 30% of all food produced. Then there's the transport sector, which is about 2.5% of all the emissions from shipping alone. Then there's fishing, which is contributes about 2.2 kilograms of carbon or carbon equivalent per landed kilo of fish. And if we look at the last one, it's like when we look at the renewable versus energy intensive technologies, if you look at alternative ways to generate alternative proteins, you find extremely high gains, or rather reductions in carbon of 80 to 90% versus conventional chicken, pork, or beef if you use alternative proteins and alternative renewable power sources. So one of the main things that it can contribute to is by collapsing collapsing the transport chains. Instead of canning tuna in Thailand and transporting it to Europe, you can now make your near tuna, or vegetable tuna, or actual tuna from cell culture in Europe. You don't need to send it by boat. One of the main challenges is that food in terms of emissions comes from its associated land use and land change activities, and not so much in the transport, retail, consumption, or waste management aspects. That's only about 30%. The big message here is 70% is in your upfront production, and only about 30% is in the post-production phase in the transport sectors. Then lastly, the last thing is probably why are we even talking about this, is because essentially energy is one of our big key carbon producers, and to keep the climate more or less the way it is at the moment, we need to almost halve our energy consumption. So this is where fish are going to help, or marine proteins or alternative proteins from marine sources. But what are the challenges? We have extremely large zone violations almost everywhere in the world, but particularly some nations in Southeast Asia are more prone to this. There's a lot of habitat destruction, particularly of seagrass. So if you know seagrass, it's considered a very high carbon sink, an excellent way to clean up disturbances in the water and siltation. And if one of the additional things with main gear use, main illegal gear use is use of trawlers, which are unselective and catch a whole lot of juveniles from a lot of different species, and these species are then used perfectly edible, but they're mainly used as trash fish. Where does the trash fish go? Predominantly it's being used as fish meal to feed the aquaculture industry. And so supplying the demand, our demand and the regional demand for fish is leading to bad practices. You can see this is a normal basket of fish from a trawler after one night. You can see these are all baby fish. This is just a close-up of what those baby fish looks like. And these are the nets. You basically can't even shove a pin through the mesh size of some of the nets. And to satisfy the demand for fresh blue swimming crabs, even when they have got eggs, which you would suspect people would leave to grow more baby blue swimming crabs, these are getting taken to the market and sold. So a typical vessel in the region with a typical catch, so that's probably about 2.5 to 4 kilos of prawns for these called centipede traps, or colloquially in Cambodia, they're known as rat tail traps. And so from this is probably 2,000 or so traps, and this is the total catch. So probably just on about 10 to 15 kilos of fish for a whole day's worth of work. Again, just to put things in context, why we're talking alternative protein. Okay, so if you look at the worst producing crops in vegetables, seeing vegetable oil, that's really palm oil. The difference between the highest and the lowest is sort of like 9 kilos. If you look at livestock, it's about 90 kilos from the highest producing to the lowest, which is eggs and dairy, so about a 90 kilogram difference in carbon. If you look at seafood, it's about the same. It's about a 9 kilogram difference between the worst and the best performing. And in this case, aquaculture is not the best performing sector in terms of carbon emissions. A little bit different, to put that even in more context, looking at fisheries, if you look at the through life cycle, and then fisheries is got a much higher ultimate or overall carbon production than aquaculture. So it's complete the inverse of the previous one. The previous one, aquaculture had highest per product, but fishery got highest through life cycle. So food and greenhouse emissions, again, why we're interested in Asia in particularly. You can see it's some of the highest farm gate emissions, and that's probably due to some of the rice and methane. Pre and post production, it's considerably larger than almost all the other countries if you look at total systems. So more reason to look at the area. Some additional challenges, blue and green water. Green water is rain. Blue water is from a river or from a dam or from an impoundment. If you look at our area, Southeast Asia here, we can see some significant changes, worse changes in terms of the coming climate change or the current experiencing in climate change. And if you look more at in terms of vulnerability, you can see that in terms of climate vulnerability, some of the countries in the region, in particular Cambodia and Laos, Philippines, and portions of Indonesia are extremely vulnerable. And this is all aspects considered of climate change. And if we look at some particular ones, we look at drought, see that's much more localized, but again, a different pattern, but more or less mimicking. You can see the importance of rain, sea level, and drought. Maybe just this little thing here is that the IPC, the latest one, 2022, said today's children in South and Southeast China will witness increased losses in coastal settlements and infrastructure due to flooding caused by unavoidable sea level rise, with the very high losses in Southeast Indian nations. It's actually the highest, most vulnerable area is Southeast Asia. Then it's not all meat, but that's not really true. It basically is all about meat. If we look at the region, increases in the region has been the highest in Southeast Asia and China, extremely high demand for meat, and the demand for more fish because it's healthy, it contains micronutrients, etc., a whole lot of things. But if we want to grow more fish in aquaculture and we don't have more fish to feed them, what can we feed them alternatively? Things like alternative proteins or changing the diet to more vegetables. You can see that already there's quite a high proportion in this. If we want more, for example, here you can see just how much more protein we need to produce to feed our need for fish. And if we change it to other protein sources, you can see the legend here, fish meal or other proteins. You can see this is the control. This is basically what's happening in the industry right now. This is diet replacement. I say novel ingredients is alternative proteins, potentially mycoproteins, algae proteins, things like that. You can see that almost still about 50% of the diet needs to come from a alternative protein source. You can only feed them so much from plant ingredients. So what are alternative proteins? Generally, when we think of alternative proteins, we think vegetable proteins, broccoli, pasta, nuts, beans, lentils, those kind of things. But actually, alternative proteins consist of a whole range of products. They can come from fish waste, for example, that can be processed, insect protein, microbial and microalgae proteins. They can come from the major algae like seaweed, and they can come from food waste. All of these things contribute to the sort of big basket of alternative proteins, and it's how do we make them? And this is probably why this presentation is probably more of a primer than a deep dive into the specifics. Essentially, if you're thinking of investing or interested in this, you need to kind of make the decision fairly early on. Do you want to make the alternative protein, or do you want to sell the equipment? Because there's N amount of equipment, and what I probably could have put in there is sell the alternative energy, because all of these things are incredibly energy needy. So is anyone using renewable energy? Yes, definitely. Some of the companies that are investing heavily in alternative protein sources also realize that they need to be saving emissions and also use alternative energy. So you can see plant-based beef like 90% less than conventional beef. Cultivated beef, so this is like cell culture beef, it's considerably less. So alternative proteins, if you just look at the sort of the animal side, there can be considerable savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we look at, should we consider that? If we look at business as usual cases, and we look at what the IPC said, we should keep under 400 or so to emission rate to keep our current climate and stay at 1.5 degrees. This is the line. As you see, we are already going over it. And even if we change to plant-rich diets or half the waste or increase the yields, it's still seen from all the emissions in the value chain, including the production, we're going to overshoot that. So what can we do to stop that? So are people interested in doing this? Yes, definitely. North America, there's just a list of companies that are investing heavily in terms of their size. You can see how much they're investing in alternative proteins. In Europe, about the same, some big names there. Asia, probably about half. And then South America, probably like a third, because this beef is so cheap to produce there, and the feeds for beef like soya for pigs and chicken and beef, very cheap there, was probably one of the reasons. And here you can definitely see population-wise, Asia is probably 2 to 3 times of Europe and North America. So potentially the market should be 2 to 3 times, but the investment is much smaller. So where and how to make a difference? Concentrating mainly on fish. I'm not sure if you can see a pattern there. My interest is mostly fish. If you're looking at where and how you can make a difference, if you look at the energy sector in particular, because that's what we are after, you can see that a lot in this region, and a lot is in one of the main producing areas is shrimp and prawns, Southeast Asia and East Asia, some of the highest energy requirements versus almost all the rest of the countries, or all the rest of the regions, and all the rest of the species used in mariculture. There's an extremely high demand for energy, and that, as I showed you, is all greenhouse gases basically going up into the atmosphere. Again, if you look at it in terms of production and why the sector is probably good, so even though the emissions is very small compared to global greenhouse emissions, you can see emission intensity, so this kilogram per kilogram meat versus overall, you can see animal protein, primarily pork, chicken, and cattle, is extremely high, almost everything less. Aquaculture and marine fisheries, very low in terms of global, but it can be higher than some of the others in terms of individual. So this I lifted from LinkedIn. There's a reference there. Essentially, why you should consider looking at biodiversity. It's much more important than you think, because the natural capital is essentially the architecture, the software, and the hardware that we run our economic activities on. And what we're doing basically is pushing a lot of malware into our natural capital by eroding the functions and reducing its ability to function. And if your computer's got a virus, it doesn't work. And that's essentially what we're doing. We're introducing malware into nature, and it's coming back to haunt us in our economic activity. So mitigating risks. Why are we even interested in this? The interplay between oceans, the habitat, and fish, the people, things inside and operate on the ocean. The ocean is the world's largest carbon sink. 90% of the excess heat generated by our increased carbon emissions is going into the ocean. Fish play an incredibly important role to make sure that the ocean is healthy, that you don't get algal blooms that excessively grow out of control. If there were no predators, the ocean would be a algal soup. So predators, which is anything from plankton to anchovies to tuna to sharks, everything eats everything else in there. And this makes sure that the ocean is the nice blue water body that we know. Is there a challenge in this? Yes. About 2/3 of the world's fish stocks are either fished at their limit, their maximum sustainable yield, sometimes much over that. So only about 1/3 of the world's populations are healthy. So should tell us something. So the role of renewable marine energy and alternative proteins, I think from the presentation, you can certainly see that there's an extremely high importance of marine fish, aquaculture or mariculture or wild caught for the region. We can also see that there's extremely high emissions. So how do we marry those two? Well, let's have a look at some of our alternative proteins and alternative feeds. For example, black soldier fly larvae, you can use that as an alternative protein. You can eat it, or you can make an alternative fish from it, use it in mycelium fish or plant-based fish. You can use crickets, the same thing basically. You can use mollusks such as green lip mussels as feedstocks for alternative proteins. You can grow mycelium, you can grow plants, you can make hybrid fish, you can use cell culture. The energy requirements for doing this is almost all low until you get to cell culture. And it depends, I'll show later, on which type of cell culture you use. And is it compatible with marine renewable energy? Yes. The bulk of these, if they're location dependent, but can be serviced by marine renewable energy. So a little bit more on the alternative feeds or foods. So black soldier fly larvae, you harvest protein and fats from them. So they can either be used, as I showed you in the beginning, as a replacement meal for real fish in aquaculture, or you can eat it directly as a standalone protein. That's all the bodybuilders in Europe apparently are very happy with black soldier fly larvae. The same for mollusks. For example, mollusks can either be a replacement in terms of protein for the alternative feedstocks for in aquaculture or mariculture system, but it can also be a standalone food, seafood, we all know, green lip mussels, or it can be a protein replacement. You can put it into pet food and take out the chicken or pork, or whatever other bycatch byproducts that go into that. In terms of energy use, insects, crickets or larvae need to be fed, whereas mollusks don't need to be fed. But you can use food waste to feed your soldier fly and crickets. They have a low spatial requirement, and they are in very small areas, so they're very suitable for low volume renewable energy. If you look at mollusks, you don't need to feed them, do carbon sequestration. They virtually need hardly any energy, only in the production stage, and they can do alternative things like help with protecting coastal habitats. So what are some of the alternative proteins that you can, so fish should have been in inverted commas as well. So you get mycelium fish, so this is basically fungi, mushroom fish, plant-based protein, so it can be a soy type material or pea type material.
Marcel, are you there? We've lost you.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry. Let's do the share thing again. It's probably our internet's been giving a little bit of drama. Okay, there we go. And we've got cell culture. And combining all of these, we see most of these are low spatial footprints. So instead of hectares and hectares to produce, you need square meters to produce. They can be done in a peri-urban environment, so shrinking the food chains or collapsing the supply chain. Instead of hundreds or thousands of kilometers, they can be done literally or virtually on site. marine renewable energy. Most of them are compatible, again, location dependent. So in terms of areas near the coast, you can do most or all of these things, and you can have sort of marine renewable resources such as floating arrays. If this looks like it's an aquaculture or mariculture pen, that is because it is. So you can combine it, for example, with raising fish in an open cage environment and putting solar panels on top. Can be a little bit more advanced, putting solar panels on top and then wind power arrays as well. Some of the benefits of this is it can cool areas down. Sea level rise is not the only challenge we face. We also face warmer ocean waters, particularly in coastal areas. So this can contribute to shading those areas. It's impervious, yes, obviously if it's floating and not a fixed installation. Much shorter transmission rates, so you don't need to put nuclear power stations at the one end of France and transport energy to the other end of France. You can put it close to Senegville and use the power, or close to Bangkok and generate the electricity right there. So you can use it directly on site. So this can use to power some of the sensor arrays that you need to see if the oxygen conversion rates are right, sea temperatures are right, and surplus can be used elsewhere. There's also some ecological leverage. For example, if you need to anchor this, you can combine it with a habitat enhancement block, such as this one in Cambodia. See lots of algal growth. And if you look at some of the other ones, it's lots of green lip mussels. It's a fish shelter and habitat site as well. So circular production, which is probably where a lot of the savings can come from. Some marine renewable energy. So if you have floating arrays, whatever kind of energy you use, it can be used to directly process the fish, whether that fish is mycelium plant or hybrid or cell culture. You can use some of the renewable energy for the alternative feedstocks. Don't need a lot of energy, but they do need some, and that can go directly into the processing of making the fish. It feeds straight into the market. From the market, there will be always, as we see, some food waste. The food waste can go directly back into alternative feeds, as well as with the market. If you change to e-vehicles and reducing carbon emissions that way, there's a lot of potential uses to reduce the carbon emissions and methane from using marine renewable energy. In terms of life cycle, just a couple of pointers there. So you can see this in vitro animal cell. Basically, that's the big brewery where you make your grow out your scaffold and animal steak from individual cells. Beef, this is conventional beef. Fungi, insects, microalgae, and microalgae is one of the highest consumers of energy, and that's a lot of that is because of the type of environment that it needs. This is all lab-based microalgae. This is not open pond culture. The lab-based ones, a lot less contamination, but also a lot higher production, and not only protein, although protein content can be as high as 50% of production. You can also make other interesting things from microalgae, like biodiesel, for example. And this normal cell culture using plants, not very high at the moment because it's got competing with conventional plants. You can see it's much lower, pork's much lower. But one of the interesting things I found that although the energy use can be very low, for example, and if you compare it to plant-based, then the energy use was fairly high if you prepare the food, getting your conventional or your steak or your animal cell steak, and you want to fry it, the portion of energy you use to cook it, and you compare it, for example, cooking the percentage energy used if you want to cook your soy patty, you per serving or per product, you use a lot more of your total energy in preparing your soy burger than you would from your animal cell-based culture. It's just interesting to me. In terms of alternative feedstocks and overall energy and production, you can see that black soldier fly, crickets, fungal, microbial, algae, and mollusk protein all have very low, except microalgae. They can all are compatible with renewable marine resources, obviously location dependent. The closer you are to the coast, the more leverage you have. The type of protein that it can produce and where it fits into the market. You can, when it says fish, you can probably substitute that for chicken or pork as well. Mycelium is probably best suited for the whole range, anything from beef to fish. Algae is probably more fish suited, and mollusks is again probably more fish suited. Electricity requirements are basically all fairly low, except for the fungal protein, because this needs to grow in a controlled environment, like lab-like conditions. The same for algae. Mollusks, again, extremely low. All of them location dependent. The closer you are to the coast, the better it will be for you. So the impacts or the best potential areas to look at to reduce carbon emissions will be the closest to the production you can introduce the energy, the better. The more you can integrate this into circular value chains, that means from waste reduction to production markets and recycling that waste, the better. The lowest cost, some of the other costs I showed was that solar panels versus conventional energy is about 3 cents per kilowatt. That's in the States, versus conventional about 19 cents a kilowatt. So renewable energy, irrespective of marine or land-based, is much lower than conventional energy. It's got the shortest transmission distance, so solar or those kinds of arrays. And if you look at the highest value add, depending on your customer acceptance.
We lost you again, Marcel. We're going to have to edit this out. Apologies, everybody. He's in Phnom Penh. He's got an ordinary connection. Let us know when you're back, Marcel. Oh dear. While we're waiting for Marcel, Dan, you notice that this is all tied into CCELL and to everything we're doing, right?
I've just pinged that, Steve. I've just been communicating with CCELL. I don't think Will's up on this call.
Yeah, it's all related.
Pardon?
It's all related. This whole thing.
It is, yeah. I mean, if his reefs can be, if his digital reefs can be optimized for mollusks, for example, so you would have a mollusk crop off a digital living reef, but you would also be restoring habitat and using a low amount of renewable energy. I could see that working. I've just been exchanging WhatsApps with Gary saying we should introduce Marcel to a chap called David Francis, who's got a sea hive solution, which looks like that little box solution in Cambodia that was on his previous slide. But what I love is the co-location of this, let's call it aquaculture or mariculture with the renewable energy source. I was also wondering how, if we understood more about it, how it might be used to counter the environmental impact of OTEC. But as Dan will be the first to tell me, I'm well beyond my scientific knowledge for that.
Yeah. Zonny, you've got a question.
Well, we're waiting for him to come back. It's more of a question and I guess a comment. You know, this is really a very good and informative presentation. So just wanted to thank you for arranging this. And you know, from my perspective, I'm quite interested to look at how you know, some of these alternative feeds, such as sort of insects, can generate jobs for women. Are there opportunities for them to have, you know, alternative livelihoods? So I guess that would be both in terms of perhaps the mollusks and as well as the insect farming. And most of the insect farms at the moment really are sort of large scale or larger scale vertical kind of operations that I have seen, and I've yet to find sort of smaller examples of where, you know, there's some insect farming going on, although I'm sure that there must be, because it's, you know, culturally in Southeast Asia, it's sort of very very common. So I would love to hear more about it and where there might be opportunities for women's employment in that area. Also,
Marcel,
sorry, just
ahead.
one last thing, and also just to add that you know, we've seen a huge increase in consumers being, you know, buying pet food, and insect protein is now also being used for pet food, which I think is has huge benefits also for biodiversity. Given that a new study that has been done looked at how much of endangered species DNA had been found in some of the more popular cat foods that people are buying. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, Zonibel, thank you for that. Marcel, just to, we lost you just when you were finishing, but let me just finish this. Zonibel, I was in Phnom Penh recently, and I visited a black soldier fly farm run by this lady who set it up on her own, and she was quite a tough individual. She sort of said, "Oh, you know, I'm going to do this and I want to do that." I was really impressed by her. She had a lot of drive, but perhaps we should look at doing something like a challenge to find who are the women in artisanal alternative protein, and do that as a challenge and shake the tree and see what falls out. That might be a good idea.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
I'm in.
Yep. Yeah, be very cool. Marcel, floor is yours again, sir.
Thanks. That was basically my last slide. Sorry, it died at the appropriate moment. This is one of the challenges with working in a you know, energy unstable environment. If we had our own personal solar panels right on top of the roof, we would have energy, but now we're grid reliant.
Well, could we carry forward that discussion?
Self-fulfilling prophecy we should do.
Can we carry forward that discussion about
Yes.
the impact of artisanal fisheries and how this works with women? Because I know you got a lot of experience on the ground in Phnom Penh, and we talked about this when I was in Phnom Penh. You want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the main challenges is always getting feed stocks that's cheap and that can compete with other feed stocks. And one of the one of the byproducts that are available a lot is from central markets is not necessarily food waste, but food scraps. You know, if you chop up a coconut, there's lots of bits of coconut chips flying all over to get to the small husk of the coconut. There's you know, lots of peeling and chopping of vegetables in almost all production. So those things are some small artisanal projects have been launched by NGOs to convert that into crickets and into black soldier fly food, not necessarily for human consumption, but offtake to either chickens as a replacement for protein in chickens, or it can potentially being used in mariculture as well, with raising fish, pond-reared fish, either on a small scale, small holder based, or even if you can produce enough black soldier fly larvae to a larger scale. So all of that's possible, but as I think Zonabel correctly pointed out, there's a huge growth in demand. So the small mariculture and aquaculture producers are actually struggling to find sort of insect protein, so sustainable insect protein, because of the pet food and the human consumption demands in Europe for insect protein, because it's got no byproducts. There's no heavy metals in it. It's fairly pure. It can be refined to lab standards. So yes, there is a growing demand for it, but you can value add that protein even more if you feed it either to fish or to chickens or even to pork as a replacement. And this is very much linked to the circular economy, where the waste of some industries or food industry can be directly converted into protein on site versus into methane at the landfill. Right? Did you get that?
Yes, I did. Methane at
Okay.
landfills is very topical at the moment after a massive fire at the Balswar landfill in New Delhi a few weeks ago. And of course, ADB DMCs have real problems with their landfills pretty much en masse. So, the base case for 92% of landfills is that they're not landfills, they're dump sites.
Yes.
I was in the Iliawan landfill in the Philippines in 2018, I think, and I walked onto the landfill and I heard the sound of pop, pop, and I looked around and there were these two ladies who were basically mashing up leftover food that had been found on the landfill, and I didn't believe it was a real thing when I heard about it. I thought it was like an urban myth, but there it was. That's going.
Yes.
The term for that is pug. So it's a thing. So this is we're getting to the stage where the fertilizer is an issue as well internationally. We're finding at the moment. So, Nick, you had a question?
Thank you. Yes, please. I won't turn my camera on because of bandwidth, but Marcel, what a fascinating presentation, and congratulations on what you do. And I just love the idea of renewable energy generating what in the project that Steve is running is called MARES, is a renewable energy approach to generate power to X, and the X bit is used for other purposes. So alternative protein from renewable energy is brilliant, and I love the co-location that you've done of wind power, or you've given us cited of wind power and solar power and so on with aquaculture and mariculture. That's long overdue, and it's brilliant to see it. Could you talk a little bit, please, about where you are? Do you see this as just demonstration? Is it low-level production? How scalable is it? And how easy is it to get big organizations, institutions, and corporates to invest in it? At what sort of stage is it? Are we still at just the early adopter stage, or are we about to go mainstream and get into some serious scalable production? Please.
Okay, I think we are at the early adopter scale, but I think what we can see is that the technology required are all mature. Like solar panels are mature. I mean, you may reduce the cost, but you want a solar panel, you can get a solar panel. You want a mariculture or aquaculture installation, you can buy it. You can buy it off Alibaba if you want. So all of the technology and infrastructure needs are mature. The challenge is that and even insect production has come, from 5 years away till now. It's gone incredibly fast and created an incredible market all of a sudden on its own. And so I think the challenge still comes in with linking all of those things together. And I think there we are on the early adopter stage is people are probably still a little bit unsure of, will this product be acceptable? If I tell people, well, I use insect protein to feed my tilapia or whatever it is, or will they be more concerned that it's a good quality fish made from a high uncontaminated protein source? So I think some of the development still needs there. Scalable, absolutely. I mean, the entire Southeast Asia and indeed probably Med or something like that, definitely scalable options there. We have extremely high water temperatures here. So in terms of mariculture, it's very good for growing fish, growing algae, growing mussels, growing oysters, all of these alternative protein sources that, the other benefit I didn't use with oysters and mussels are that they carbon sequestrate immediately. They build their own shell from the carbon that they absorb from the water, which comes from the ocean, which comes from your car. So that can be done immediately. I think what's probably needed is, I won't say demonstration projects, although that may help, but it actually needs investor support. I know there's a couple of institutions that are seeking funding to say, we've got this brilliant idea, we just need someone to trust us that it's got legs. And if we look at demand out there, I don't see anyone buying less fish. I just see people buying more fish.
Brilliant. And I'm hogging the conversation here, but there's always a compromise. Have you identified the unintended consequences of this approach? Are there any unintended consequences, or are they all manageable and acceptable in environmental terms?
In terms of environmental terms, I think obviously all mariculture or aquaculture facilities produce waste and high nitrogen levels. But nitrogen is a standard feedstock by other aquatic organisms. So I think if you play around with density, you look at the bacteria content below your cages, and you look at filter feeders that can actually absorb some of the nitrogen before it actually becomes a bad bacteria breeding ground, you can certainly mitigate a whole lot of that potential or previous negative activities associated with mariculture. Again, you do not need to grow just fish. If you just grow the entire facility as a mussel farm or as an oyster farm, then you can do on land or on activities where you can basically filter out the nitrogen, and the nitrogen you can actually use as fertilizer again and put that into hydroponics. So and that way you use a lot of that nitrogen and bind it into vegetables such as tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever the case. Lots of plants do very well in aquaponic based systems. So there's what I'm basically saying is we need to rethink the way we produce protein and what the natural systems we use to produce that protein and to make them as circular and carbon negative as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marcel. Cracking presentation. I'm going to shut up and let other people have a go.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nick. Would anybody else like to ask some questions? I'm keen to hear from some of the other folks. Marcel, just out of interest, where do you see the greatest potential for this in ADB's member countries? Was it Manila? Is it Philippines, Cambodia? Where do you see this being an approach for alternative protein? If you were to go, where would you go?
Okay, so Gulf of Thailand is really good. So because basically, if you want to use marine renewable resources, because no cyclones, low wind shear, basically very good ocean conditions to establish the arrays. Then also warm temperatures, low in the water, so you can basically grow anything. Shallow waters, lots of coastal communities that are looking for alternative alternative ways to leverage livelihoods and income. So, instead of working in a factory in a controlled temperature environment, you could go and raise your own protein and supply a growing market demand in the region. Because fish consumption, I don't think is going to decrease. I think it's only going to increase, and we need more people to produce protein and get more individual employers in the process. You can see there's a huge demand, as I showed you, of a very low level of investment, probably a third of the investment below Europe and the Americas. So yeah, definitely. And this is one of the main centers of demand for that product. So Philippines, again, yes, but the challenge for Philippines may be cyclones. So it's a little bit more exposed. So you may need much more robust industries. So it's not for everywhere, but it's for almost everywhere.
Okay. Because that leads on to the point about what do you do with the people who are already fishing those areas in the middle of the night with their green lights that comes up on satellite images. But yes. I suppose if you're looking at this, would you be getting higher production with a higher protected area for smaller fish?
Absolutely, you would definitely be getting much, because those boats can't really fish in those areas. And what you would also be getting is, if we combine it with the marine rehabilitation blocks, so you get a lot more algae and seagrass structure, and so these will be absorbing your nitrogen, and you'll get a higher growth, as we've seen on some of the experimental sites, of fish. So productivity is up by 30%. The blue swimming crabs are much bigger and much better quality. So and the blocks don't actually interfere with the fishing activities. Fishermen are now, the ones using legal gear, are now coming more and more into the areas that they previously shunned, because they thought the blocks would drive them away and they wouldn't be able to fish. It's actually created, enhanced the habitat to such a degree that more and more fishermen are now being able to make a living from it. So again, if you can combine this with energy production, and you can combine it with the raising of alternative protein, you can actually leverage the production both in terms of biomass, energy from those areas. So it's not excluding anything, it's just changing user space, user product, and the mix of utilization.
Okay. Karina has brought up a really good question in the chat, talking about permitting. And I think when we were in Cambodia, I was talking about how part of what we're trying to do with MARA is to try and create a structure, or an awareness of a structure that would allow people to develop these areas and achieve common outcomes. Could you talk a little bit about experience you've had in countries about how offshore permitting is done, and what's good and what possibly could be improved?
Okay, so I think probably everyone's main challenge is red tape, the extreme, difficult and long, tortuous administrative procedure required to do this. Cambodia, I think, has maybe got a little bit of a shorter lead time, in that communities are in community fisheries areas have a fairly high degree of autonomy in terms of what they allow to develop in their areas or not. So a much smoother track for local communities. Foreign investors, wanting extremely large swaths of land, that type of permitting will definitely take longer. Then there's the huge administrative burden. But it has been done, and it can be done. And because of the food security issues, because of employment issues, I think if we can work on reducing some of the uncertainty, again, because people think if you do this, you will destroy the coast. And with the examples we have, you can actually enhance the coast. You may change the scenery, so there will be cages, or there may be towers, or there may be something like that. So And I think that the same issue is, would you rather want a very high carbon producing coal burning factory on your doorstep, or would you have wind towers that, maybe scenically not so pretty, but much more sustainable in the long run and will keep the sea level from encroaching on your house? So we kind of back to those kind of decisions. See, we've got. Okay.
Alvin, you want to go?
Yeah, hi, Marcel. How's it going? Hey,
Hey.
Marcel, I think Steve also mentioned earlier that we have been closely coordinating and having input from yourselves as well in discussions in preparation of the coastal and marine fisheries project. So what do you see as the low-hanging fruits in that particular project and integration of some of these ideas? And what has the discussions been to date?
Okay, so I think the main challenges are, again, not technological. The main challenges are probably more on an institutional and intergovernmental level. I think there's certainly at the community level a much faster acceptance than there may be at government level. I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi is just really bad.
We can hear you really well, Marcel. Keep going. We can hear you, Marcel. Now we can't hear you.
Maybe you want to turn off your camera.
Yeah, that might be an idea.
Sorry. Yeah, so like lots of alternative energy issues that we're experiencing today, probably just proving the fact that if you have more independent power suppliers, then you probably fix a whole lot of networking issues as well.
Alvin, was that enough for you, or you want some more?
I'm not sure if maybe it went off halfway. I think, Marcel, my specific question was, we've been having discussions around this, and the TRTA. Marcel, can you hear me?
Everything going.
Marcel,
turn your camera off, Marcel.
Marcel, can you hear me?
No.
Goodness.
Can you hear us now, Marcel? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Alvin.
All right, Marcel, my specific.
Sorry, I don't know what I'm even on my mobile phone. Yeah, sorry.
Can you hear me specifically?
Yes.
Yeah, my specific question was, we've been having various discussions along with the TRTA, or project preparation team, on the coastal marine fisheries project. So my question was, what do you see as specific low-hanging fruits which can be already integrated into that project, given your understanding quite well on the design of that project?
Sorry, Alvin, the call quality is extremely bad. I don't know if the mobile network can't handle it.
Okay, well, look, Marcel, what we might do is we might round off there, but I think we've got a lot of things out of this. Zonibel and I have been talking offline about a great idea, and we'll hopefully carry that forward. And this recording will be loaded onto the data room. And if you've got any other questions for Marcel, please feel free to email me and I'll forward them on. So Marcel, thank you so much for today. And on that note, we'll end the recording. Thank you.
Thanks.